Welcome to our soothing journey into a world where the life of a knight was far from the idealized images we often see in movies and books. You are probably familiar with the image of a knight fighting in a tournament, defending the honor of a lady, with a sparkle in his eye and a sword in his hand. We see him, shining in armor against the backdrop of beautiful fields, valiant behavior, feats, and heroism. But behind this bright romantic image lies something much more difficult and cruel. Medieval knights were not only fighters for justice, they were also people who were forced not only to fight, but also to endure countless sufferings, to work at the limits of their capabilities, to experience physical pain and moral exhaustion. Their lives were filled not only with swords and feats, but also with endless difficulties. This life required courage and strength not only in battle, but also in everyday, often painful trials. Imagine you are a young knight, faced with a choice: to become part of this cruel, dangerous life, or to give up the opportunity to ever be part of the great order of knights. You grew up with dreams of glory and fortune, of being a hero, fighting for honor and justice. But the reality is that your life will be filled not only with victories on the battlefield, but also with many small sacrifices and losses that will gradually destroy your soul with each passing day. Medieval society was largely built on feudal relations, and the knight was an important link in this system. However, despite their status and titles, knights were not free. They were dependent on their lords, kings, and the church. Serving your lord meant not only protecting his land and army, but also following all his orders, even if they were unfair or required personal sacrifice. Knightly orders and their code of honor demanded from each knight not only military valor, but also moral fortitude, which was often tested in real life. To be a knight meant to be prepared not only for battle on the battlefield, but also to fight with one's own soul, with those demons that were generated by the harsh conditions of life. Every day in a knight's life was full of struggle for the title, struggle for land, struggle for honor. In these conditions, a knight had to be prepared for unimaginable difficulties. Knightly duties are not only pride and glory, but also strict discipline, renunciation of personal desires, and the constant threat of death. This code left no room for weakness. You could not simply give in or refuse to fight. Such thoughts could be regarded as shameful and a violation of knightly honor. In this video, we will explore not only the greatness of the knights, but also the trials they endured. We will show what life as a knight in the Middle Ages really meant: constant warfare, suffering, moral conflicts, and ultimately the decline of their orders and their loss of military relevance in a changing world. Get ready for a slow, deep dive into these brutal realities. When a young man in the Middle Ages decided to become a knight, his path began with brutal and years of training. It was a path where there was no room for weakness or fear. The future knight began his journey at around the age of 7, when he was sent to the home of a more experienced knight or nobleman to become a squire. It was a kind of vow of silence and obedience, where the boy remained in the shadow of the older knights, carrying out their orders and learning the basics of the military craft. His day began early in the morning, with prayer and preparation for hard training. For a knight, there were no days off or holidays. Every morning, he began training, which included not only physical exercises, but also weapons training, strategy, and tactics. The boy had to learn how to handle a sword, spear, shield, and other means of defense. These were not simple trainings, but harsh, grueling exercises that tested the limits of human endurance. Over the years, the squire learned more complex skills, becoming more and more prepared each year. He studied not only martial arts, but also the art of communication, etiquette, and the social norms of knightly society. This meant that the young knight had to know how to treat the aristocracy, how to behave at feasts, how to express his loyalty and respect for his lord. A knight had to be not only a warrior, but also a representative of a certain social group that expected ideal behavior from him. But training was not just learning the arts. It was a path of physical exhaustion, pain, and fear. Many young men who tried to become knights could not withstand these stresses and grew tired, forgetting about their dreams of glory and greatness. Those who survived and passed these difficult tests became knights, but their bodies were already ingrained with the habit of enduring pain and suffering. At times, many of them never knew the pleasure of rest. A knight lived in constant tension, ready to fight at any moment. Another important part of their training was regular physical exercise. For many years, they were trained in martial arts, as well as horse riding, a skill that was critical for a knight. Horses were an integral part of chivalry, and the ability to fight from the saddle became vital. The young knight learned the art of fighting on foot and in cavalry units, where each battle was imbued not only with military necessity, but also with a code of honor. From an early age, the knight was also taught strategic thinking, understanding how important not only physical strength, but also the ability to think on the battlefield are. He was trained not only in combat techniques, but also in planning and logistics. It was a comprehensive approach, where physical training went hand in hand with intellectual development. The importance of moral preparation should not be forgotten. From the very beginning, young knights were taught to value the ideals of honor, loyalty, and nobility. These values were an important part of their upbringing, as a knight had to be not only a great warrior, but also a worthy person who followed strict moral standards. Despite all the trials, a knight had to keep his spirit unyielding, be able to withstand pain and fatigue, but at the same time, not lose his virtue and honor. Every knight who reached this level understood that being a knight was not only a privilege, but also a burden, which came with constant self-control and immense devotion to one's obligations. Becoming a knight meant going through not only physical and moral tests, but also experiencing internal conflicts associated with the inevitable sacrifices he had to make for his goal. For a medieval knight, life in armor was not just a symbol of greatness or part of his military training. It was a heavy physical, emotional, and moral burden that had to be faced on a daily basis. Understanding that this armor, which was an elaborate metal plate, was both a protection and a burden, did not come immediately, but only with experience, which began in the earliest years of training. Imagine being 15 or 16 years old and putting on a full suit of knightly armor for the first time. It's a huge amount of iron, each piece covering a part of your body, from your head, where a chainmail helmet hides your face, to your feet, where metal boots that protect against impact make every movement extremely awkward. Your arms are limited in movement by heavy gloves, and the weight of this entire set can exceed 25 to 30 kilograms. It's not just a heavy load, but a test of your physical endurance and tolerance to pain. Every knight who dons his armor not only protects himself from the weapons of his enemy, but must also overcome his own physical limitations. His feet slip on the cold, damp stone of the castle, and every step is a struggle. The leather straps on his back chafe, the metal bands on his chest press on his ribs, and every movement becomes more tiring. This all becomes especially painful during long marches, when the knight must walk on muddy roads, in pouring rain, or in brutal heat. His body suffers from strain and pain, but he must keep moving, for his duty demands it. On the battlefield, where a knight must be able to fight and defend himself quickly, armor does not just become heavy, it begins to act as an additional enemy. Imagine that, at the moment of battle, when the whole world around you begins to disappear, the air smells of blood and sweat, and the ground under your nails feels sticky and wet. You have to fight with a heaviness that limits every movement. Despite all its strength, this armor limits maneuverability. Sword strikes become weaker due to fatigue, movements are slow and imprecise, and every step is given through effort. Eventually, the physical strain of constantly wearing armor becomes too much for the knight's body. On the battlefield, where the time for rest is minimal, a careless movement or a delay in reaction can cost a life. The knight, despite his training, was doomed to face the harsh reality of these heavy suits. Unlike modern military equipment, which is specifically designed to facilitate movement, knightly armor was not ideal in this regard. It was made of iron or steel, which made it extremely effective in protecting against arrows, spears, and swords. But it did not take into account the physical strain of wearing such armor for a long time, which affected stamina. Even the most experienced knights, who had trained for years in these suits, experienced problems with breathing and movement, especially when walking long routes in military conditions. An additional problem was that the armor had to be constantly maintained in good condition. It had to be looked after, cleaned, and repaired so that it did not rust, warp, or become uncomfortable to wear. This was an important part of a knight's life, because damaged armor not only reduced its protective properties, but could also cause injury. So even when a knight was resting, his time was often spent on maintaining his equipment. Soon, this became not just a daily necessity, but a real chore that did not allow him to relax and rest. And if we talk about the climate, the picture becomes even more difficult. Imagine that on a hot summer day, when the air is scorching hot and the sun is merciless, you have to wear armor. Imagine how your body overheats, how every moment becomes torture. The summer heat makes you sweat, and the iron becomes red hot, which causes burns and a terrible feeling of fatigue. This is not just an inconvenience, it is a real threat to health. It is impossible to concentrate on the battle when your body is going through such suffering. And in this situation, the knight still has to remain strong, resilient, and ready to fight. However, armor also played an important role in creating the image of a knight. It was not just a protective set, it was a symbol. When a knight appeared on the battlefield in full armor, regardless of his physical condition, he was credited with strength and power. On the other hand, a knight who took off his armor after a hard battle looked exhausted, as if he had suffered a defeat, even if he was the winner. Armor could hide weaknesses. It represented the ideal of strength, but only until the moment when it was removed, and the knight again became an ordinary man, tormented by the very pains that he hid behind his iron appearance. Over time, knights learned to appreciate and respect not only their functionality, but also the need to take care of their bodies, which were constantly under physical strain. In the end, armor became not just an element of equipment, but a real test, symbolizing both the price of knighthood and his daily struggle with himself and the world around him. Every knight knew that armor was not only his protection, but also his curse, his cross that he carried with him, no matter how great his valor or desire to win. The life of a medieval knight knew no rest. Almost from the moment a knight was elevated to his honorary rank, his life became an endless preparation and participation in wars, battles, and conflicts that often dragged on for months or even years. Knights could not simply live in peace, enjoying their lands and titles. In a feudal system, where most lands and rights belonged to the supreme rulers, and knights had to defend these lands, they became part of a huge military machine that required them to constantly engage in wars. The medieval knight was essentially a military mercenary of his time. He might not participate in every campaign, but his role in protecting and expanding territories was always central. From the moment a knight acquired his title, he understood that his life would be filled not only with battles, but also with moral obligations, which included both fighting for his own honor and fulfilling his obligations to his lord. When a king or feudal lord decided to declare war, the knight was obliged to fight. This was not only his job, but also a part of his social status. Every war was part of a knight's life. There were no stable times of peace. Even if one conflict ended, another would soon begin, and in it, the knight would most likely be at the center of events again. In this sense, a knight was not only taught to fight, but also taught to live in conditions of constant danger. Throughout his life, a knight would likely be not only a warrior, but also a survivor, with little time for rest or personal life. His place was in the battle lines, in the troops, on campaigns, in the defense of lands. In essence, a knight, being in constant readiness, could never feel out of the game. Any peaceful life became impossible due to constant threats and external conflicts. Hostile kingdoms, ambitions, and internal political struggle always led to new campaigns and battles, where knights were simply a tool in the hands of higher authorities. For example, we recall the Crusades, where knights went far beyond their homelands to fight for religious or political goals, sacrificing themselves to fulfill the will of their lord or king. These campaigns were not an exception, but rather the norm. Every war for a knight was not only a physical test, but also an emotional struggle. The clashes on the battlefield were full of cruelty and death. Even in the most successful moments, knights returned home with wounds, both physical and mental. Each battle became not only a reason for victory, but also a source of an indelible mark on their lives. An example of this can be the knights participating in the Crusades, who returned home changed not only physically, but also morally. Victories and defeats on the battlefield did not pass without a trace, and the consequences of each campaign affected the knights, sometimes destroying their personality, forcing them to doubt their ideals and motives. It was through such wars that knights became symbols of their time. Their lives were not only filled with battles and victories, but also with the sacrifices they made. On the battlefield, they not only defended honor, but also faced the harshest conditions, which often left them with physical disabilities for life. But at the same time, knights understood that their life was, in fact, an inevitable path, and it was impossible to refuse this path. It was a life of constant struggle, a struggle for survival and honor. In a context of constant warfare, knights became not only warriors, but also a link between their states and personal duties. They had to not only follow orders, but also be prepared for changes in military tactics and methods of warfare, which over time became more complex and diverse. However, despite all these changes, the knights' constant readiness to fight remained their constant characteristic. This image was not only a symbol of their status, but also of the physical and moral strength they had to display in a world where war was the norm. After all, a knight who did not fight could not remain a knight. It was his role in society, his obligation, and his duty. All his titles and possessions depended on it. Thus, war became an integral part of his existence. The impossibility of living a peaceful life was not only inevitable, but also necessary for his status in the eyes of society. That is why a knight was always a warrior, always ready for battle, and always looking for an opportunity to show his valor on the battlefield. When we talk about knights, one of the most striking and attractive aspects of their lives is, of course, their code of honor. This code was not just a set of moral norms, but an entire philosophy that knights had to follow. It was a rule that raised their behavior to the highest level, forcing them to be not only great warriors, but also examples of virtue for the entire society. However, as with most moral principles, reality often diverged from the ideal. Imagine being a knight in the Middle Ages, and having to abide by a strict code that includes virtues such as bravery, loyalty, honesty, and justice. According to this code, you are obliged to protect the weak, fight for justice, avoid conflicts with the innocent, and always adhere to duty, even if it means personal sacrifice. All this sounds like a great goal, but the reality was much more complex and multifaceted. The concept of honor itself was not only moral, but also practical. On the battlefield, a knight was obliged to fight the cruelty of the enemy, but always within the limits of honest methods, trying to avoid treachery and meanness. For example, an enemy who surrendered or was unarmed could not be killed. Ideally, a knight was to protect the lives of the innocent and fight only those who threatened his lord or territory. This also meant that a knight could not simply choose to fight on a whim. He was obliged to act in the interests of his country, order, or king. In reality, however, upholding these ideals by warriors was much more complex. On the battlefield, a knight was faced with making split-second decisions that did not always correspond to the morality or philosophy of the code of honor. For example, when the enemy was surrounded and in a position that excluded his victory, a knight might face a moral dilemma. Should he end the battle quickly and efficiently, or leave the enemy alive, observing fairness and humanity? In most cases, of course, victory was the top priority, and the code of honor became an abstract concept against the real brutality of war. In addition, a knight had to be loyal to his lord or king, which meant that personal principles often took a back seat. This was another aspect of knightly life that could conflict with the ideal. If a knight believed that his lord was being unfair or cruel, he could not refuse to carry out an order, as this could result in disgrace and loss of title. This created moral tension, especially if the knight was faced with political or military decisions that conflicted with his own beliefs. Knights also had to watch their honor in relation to their behavior in society. The code of honor implied that a knight had to be an example to others, especially to the lower classes. He had to observe decorum, be kind-hearted, accommodating, and generous. This was another side of the knight's image that made him idealized in the eyes of people. He could not afford moral weaknesses or mistakes, since his entire reputation depended on how others perceived him. But the life of a knight was not so simple. Even if a knight always tried to follow his code, he was constantly tested, and every choice he had to make could be clouded by guilt or regret. He could make a mistake or break one of his obligations, and then his reputation could be damaged and his honor could be questioned. In fact, mistakes were part of human nature, and knights, like everyone else, often found themselves faced with moral dilemmas. Imagine a knight fighting on a battlefield where his honor is at stake. He may win or lose, but no matter how the battle ends, he must always remain true to his duty. Sometimes he must choose between his own life and the lives of others. For example, if a knight found himself in a situation where he could have avoided death by betraying his comrades, he had to remember that such a victory would not be a true victory, but only a disgrace that could not be washed away. His life was tied to the greatness of his actions and decisions, which had to be consistent with his inner principles. Yet, despite all these moral and physical efforts, the ideals of chivalry, including the code of honor, played an important role in shaping the culture of the Middle Ages. These principles and values became symbols not only for the knights, but for their society as a whole. And although reality often violated them, the knights still strove to be true to their ideals, and this brought them respect, admiration, and even mythological greatness, which remains in our perception to this day. After all, a knight's code of honor was not only the outer shell of his life, but also the inner core that allowed him to overcome doubts, fears, and difficulties, which in turn made him truly great in the eyes of his contemporaries. Military campaigns were an integral part of a knight's life in the Middle Ages, and they left an indelible mark on the fate of every knight who took part in them. These campaigns, which often lasted for months and sometimes years, were filled with danger, hardship, and the constant threat of death. For a knight, campaigns were not only a physical test, but also a moral test, when every step forward could lead to the loss of friends and comrades, and failure could be fatal for both him and his army. Imagine that you were a knight about to embark on another long campaign. Your armor is heavy to put on, and not only do you have to wear it all the time, but you also have to take a supply of food and water with you, since there may be settlements along the way that provide only a minimum of resources. You know that there are unknown lands ahead, sometimes wild and completely alien, and that the road will be long, difficult, and full of dangers. Behind every mountain, behind every forest, there may be not only enemies, but also natural obstacles. Rivers, hills, wastelands that force soldiers to carry heavy equipment on their backs. During these long marches, the knights faced many difficulties. Traveling through hostile territories meant the constant threat of attacks, both from locals and from other hostile armies. The weather was also not on the knights' side. Heavy rain, snowfalls, and cold winds could significantly slow down an army's progress, making the conditions on the roads terrible. It was not only the knights who suffered the most, but also their servants, the peasants who carried supplies, and all those who were forced to follow the army. Small roads, unprotected settlements, and food shortages all added to the warriors' difficulties, and the constant fear of disease and hunger was a real threat. The wars and campaigns themselves were not limited to battles. Knights had to get used to the cold reality of military conflicts. They not only fought enemies on the battlefield, but also led long sieges, which were not only a tactical test, but also a moral torture for soldiers. Besieged cities or fortresses could turn into hell when food supplies were in short supply, and rain and slush slowed the advance of armies. Sometimes sieges lasted for months, and moral fatigue was worse than any physical pain. Even when the army finally reached enemy territory, the knight's job was not limited to fighting other armies. He had to perform equally difficult tasks, distributing daily duties, maintaining discipline among his soldiers, organizing supplies and equipment. Morale was the key to success on such campaigns. Soldiers and knights did not simply fear their enemies, they feared fatigue, disease, and hunger, which always threatened those who found themselves in a foreign land far from home. In addition, there was not only physical suffering in the campaigns, but also psychological. Many knights who survived long campaigns faced depression, feelings of alienation, and even a condition that could be called burnout. Knights who fought in one campaign after another often lost their sense of meaning and purpose. In many cases, they could not survive the brutal losses on the battlefield, the loss of their friends and comrades. The knowledge that victory in one battle could be paid for by losses in the next became a heavy burden for many knights, and not everyone could cope with it. But even when the knight survived all these trials, at the end of the campaign, having defeated the enemy, he had to do more than just return home. Upon his return, new tasks, new campaigns, and new wars often awaited him. The sword, which was a source of pride and a symbol of knightly dignity, became a tool for a life steeped in war. Was there a reward for all these trials? Of course, the knight could return home with awards, titles, and land grants, but what was behind it? Only deep personal sacrifices and a constant struggle that defined his entire life. Thus, each campaign was not just a fight against external enemies, but also against life itself. Having gone through many suffering trials, the knight understood that war is not only a fight for territory or wealth, but also a fight for survival, where every step forward could be the last. In the end, most knights returned not only with riches, but also with mental and physical traumas that could not be healed by time. War remained with them, despite victories and glory. The life of a knight in the Middle Ages, despite all its noble and heroic components, was inextricably linked with wounds, injuries, and illnesses. The battles that a knight fought on the battlefield not only put him in front of enemies, but also exposed his life to danger through physical trauma. Wounds were an inevitable part of a knight's life, but not every knight could survive them, despite his fighting skills and fortitude. Picture this. You are in the middle of a battle, surrounded by the clash of swords and battle axes. The ground around you is covered in blood, and every fight becomes not only a question of victory, but also of survival. Suddenly, in a moment of carelessness or under pressure from the enemy, you feel a blow to your side. A sharp pain pierces your body. But on the battlefield, there is no time for doubt or fear. You continue to fight despite the pain, despite the blood that is penetrating your clothes with each passing moment. The steel of your weapon and shield may protect you from the blow, but your own wounds are what you will have to deal with off the battlefield. Injuries were inevitable. While swords and spears were the primary weapons, fighting was often done with brutal, unprotected movements, where every mistake could cost a life. Even if a knight used his shield or armor, they could not always protect against fatal wounds. Punctures, lacerations, blows to the face, arms, and legs often became the cause of serious injuries. An injury that was received on the battlefield could not always be immediately treated or cured, as is possible today with modern medical methods. Imagine returning to camp after a bloody battle, and despite your wounds, you can't immediately lie down and rest. Wounded knights could not always be examined and treated immediately, and many were left with excruciating pain or with injured limbs that were difficult to treat without the necessary medical supplies. In the event that the wound was not serious, the knight could still lose the ability to fight or move without assistance. However, even in the case of severe wounds, a knight could not afford to stay away. He knew that if he left the battlefield, it could lead to shame and loss of honor. Infections were another brutal reality of a knight's life. Treatment for wounds in the Middle Ages was extremely limited. Simple infections that we might treat with antibiotics were often fatal in those days. Simple cuts could lead to inflammation and gangrene, and if the wound was not properly treated, it could be fatal. Under these conditions, knights who fought in months-long campaigns or sieges often faced additional problems. They could lose not only their physical ability to fight, but also be bedridden, suffering from illnesses they could not overcome. Moreover, what we today consider minor injuries, such as cuts or sprains, were extremely dangerous in the Middle Ages. Without antibiotics and effective antiseptics, even small wounds often led to serious consequences. Many knights did not survive such wounds and died from simple infections that could be prevented today. But even with serious injuries, a knight, returning from the battlefield, had to continue his service, often without the opportunity to fully recover. Imagine how a knight of 30 to 35 years old, who has been through dozens of battles, feels on the battlefield. His body is no longer as flexible as in his youth. The injuries he received earlier begin to remind him of themselves, and old scars left from battles become a source of chronic pain. Each battle now brings not only the threat of death, but also physical pain, which the knight must learn to live with. The body, which was once resilient and strong, is now tired and worn out. The significance of these injuries was not only physical. For a knight whose life and honor were built on his success in battle, the loss of his fighting ability meant the loss of his status and dignity. Failure to defend his lands or to fulfill his duties could lead to the condemnation of his lord or society. And, as unfair as it may seem, many knights were forced to hide their injuries to avoid appearing weak or unfit for further battle. Moreover, injuries were not only the result of combat. The extreme conditions of campaigns and sieges also led to numerous illnesses. Bed sores, injuries from sitting for long periods in the mud or on wet surfaces, loss of health due to chronic fatigue and lack of food. All this was part of the knight's reality. These additional sufferings were not always visible, but they had a profound effect on the physical and mental state of each knight. Thus, the life of a knight was full of not only feats, but also suffering. Wounds on the battlefield became constant companions of knights, and it was they that formed the cruel reality of medieval military life. These wounds not only violated the physical integrity of the knight, but also left an indelible mark on his life, influenced his perception of himself and the world around him, which became the norm of his existence. While castles represent a symbol of strength, power, and protection, for a knight, life within these strong walls was not nearly as comfortable as it might seem at first glance. In fact, medieval castles, although they served as fortresses designed to protect against enemies, were far from cozy and comfortable for their owners. They were places where knights often spent most of their lives, But it was not a place for rest, but rather for constant anticipation, both from battles and from political changes. Imagine a castle with its stone walls, cramped corridors, and cold stone halls. The temperature in these rooms varied with the seasons, and in winter they became real freezers. For many months of the year, castles had no effective heating systems, and although there was a fire in the fireplaces, the heat quickly disappeared, leaving the halls cold and damp. The knight, in turn, had to not only endure these conditions, but also obey the strict rules of life established in the castle. The knight's rooms themselves were often devoid of comfort. A simple wooden bed, covered with a rough mattress of straw, served as a place to rest after long training or military campaigns. In exchange for high titles and lands, knights were faced with a harsh reality, where even basic comfort was something unattainable. Moreover, a knight's life in a castle was not just a matter of arrangement. The castle was the center of political life, and its inhabitants were part of a complex hierarchy. The knight, as a ruler or commander, was responsible for the safety, well-being, and order not only of his lands, but also within the castle. The time the knight spent within these walls was often spent on organization and management, as well as on interaction with local feudal lords, administration, and even ambassadors from other kingdoms. Castles were usually built with strategic locations in mind, and knights had to defend these fortifications, maintain them, monitor their defenses, and provide security. In addition, knights often remained in the castle in anticipation of new threats or rebels, and this constant tension, the need to be ready for battle or defense, made their daily life much more difficult. If the castle was in an area of possible attacks, the life of a knight could be filled with anxiety and strategic tasks, including defense not only from external enemies, but also from internal threats, such as uprisings or rebellions of local peasants. In the castle, knights also faced responsibilities towards their servants and the peasants who worked on their lands. The work of maintaining order in the settlements, collecting taxes, resolving local conflicts, and running the farm took up a lot of time. It was not only a political and military responsibility, but also a strict routine that required a lot of patience and attention to detail from the knight. Even rest in such conditions often became a problem, since the knight could not afford the luxury of endless rest without worrying about his duties. The psychological burden of castle life was also significant. Often knights felt isolated from the outside world while within these fortified walls. A castle built for protection often became a place of confined space for a knight, where his every step was limited by the walls, where each day began and ended with obligations to the master or ruler. It was a place where they were obliged to observe strict disciplines and norms, maintain order, and uphold their reputation, despite personal fatigue and doubts. In addition, life in the castle also meant the continuation of the war in a figurative sense. The castle was part of a network of fortifications and defenses, and its inhabitants were part of a feudal structure that was constantly experiencing internal conflicts and power struggles. The uncertainty of future conflicts, political intrigues and struggles for influence in the kingdom, forced the knight to be on guard and not allow himself to relax. It was a life constantly filled with danger, internal and external threats, which forced the knight to always be ready for new battles, political maneuvers, and even rebellions. The cruelest aspect of castle life was its isolation. Relations with the outside world, even if the castle was a dream for the strong, remained limited. Knights were rarely able to leave the castle, especially during times of war, when every hour was important. To be a knight living in a castle meant being part of a social class that, despite its power and prestige, was always involved in politics and strategy, and often had to make decisions that were not always in their best interests. The castle might be the place where a knight gained his power and titles, but it was also the place that imposed strict limits and obligations on him, making his life not only a battlefield, but also an arena of internal struggle and self-sacrifice. Every stay in the castle became a test of strength, and the knight, despite his high social role, often felt locked within these walls, where his life and fate depended on external factors that were beyond his control. Medieval feasts, often depicted in novels and films as scenes of luxury, abundance, and non-stop merriment, were in fact far from as carefree and festive as they are often portrayed. Knights and aristocrats, despite their titles and privileges, did not always enjoy true comfort at the festive table. In fact, many of these feasts were filled with discomfort illness, and social tensions that could have been avoided if the conditions had been just a little more favorable. Imagine that you are a knight attending a banquet in a huge castle, where the sounds of laughter, the clatter of cups, and the clink of silver fill the air. The food on the tables is abundant: meat, bread, fish, wine, fruit pies, and mead. But behind all this apparent luxury, there are many shortcomings. Many of the foods that were on the tables came not only over-seasoned, but also with the risk of food poisoning. In the Middle Ages, food storage conditions left much to be desired, and food, especially meat, could easily spoil. Refrigeration did not exist, and because of this, meat often had to be stored outdoors or in places where the temperature was unreliable. This inevitably led to the food quickly losing its freshness and could become a source of disease. Alcohol at feasts was not only a drink for pleasure, but also an important way to hide the less than stellar qualities of the food. Wine, beer, and mead flowed freely, as alcohol not only quenched thirst, but was also one of the ways to eliminate the unpleasant smell of food or recent contamination. Drunkenness was the norm at medieval feasts, and sometimes it turned into wild drinking bouts when guests lost control of themselves. Emotions and moods at such celebrations were unpredictable. Feasts could quickly degenerate into rough talk, arguments, and even fights. Excessive drinking also led to poisoning, or alcohol poisoning, which became quite common among knights and aristocrats. Stomach diseases caused by excessive drinking and poor food became common among those who regularly participated in such feasts. Life at a castle feast was not limited to food and entertainment. It was also an important social event, where knights, aristocrats, and feudal lords gathered to discuss politics, make deals, or listen to the advice of their allies. However, it was not only a time of fun, but also a chance to assert one's power, demonstrate one's position, and benefit from new contacts. Feasts were part of a larger social game in which each participant had to maintain their status. Personal dignity, political power, and wealth were often put above one's own comfort. For knights, it was not just a time to relax, but also a place where they could demonstrate their strength, negotiating skills, or make important deals. Despite their importance to social life, feasts were rarely entirely free of tension. The arrangement of seats at the table was a determining factor in the politics and relationships within the castle. The fish and meat dishes, the delicacies placed on the tables, indicated the status of those seated next to the host. Those who were not close friends or high-profile guests might find themselves in the background, cleaning up the remains of food or simply watching as the real aristocrats enjoyed their meals. These feasts had their own hierarchy, and it would be a disgrace for many to find themselves in a situation where they had to settle for ordinary food or were unable to join others. In addition to food and drink, feasts were often considered a time for entertainment. Music, dancing, even theatrical performances were all part of the atmosphere of a feast. However, it is important to note that not every knight was delighted with these entertainments. Many preferred to devote the time to their military training or to take a break from political intrigue. Feasts became not only an opportunity for social interaction, but also sometimes a necessary part of life, which may not always be pleasant, but necessary for maintaining a reputation. It should also be taken into account that at many feasts, knights and aristocrats were subject to numerous ethical restrictions. Cutlery was rare, and most guests used only their hands, which was part of the knightly code. This meant that food could be quite uncomfortable, especially if it was fatty game or fish, which required special care and handling. And most importantly, the act of eating itself became part of a ritual in which it was important not only to enjoy the taste of the food, but also to monitor one's behavior. A feast was a place where every movement and word was closely watched. A knight who did not know how to behave at a feast could easily lose the respect of those around him. The medieval feast was thus a place of contradictions. On the one hand, it was a symbol of wealth and power. On the other, it was a place where knights faced the harsh realities of dietary inconvenience, social hierarchy, and political games. And despite all the outward luxury, feasts were often places of trials, fear, and even illness, which a knight had to endure for the sake of his honor and reputation. Many people living in the Middle Ages perceived knights as symbols of wealth and luxury. Knights were often depicted as owners of large lands with beautiful castles, luxurious clothes, and many servants. However, the reality was far from favorable. The poverty of knights, especially those who did not belong to the upper aristocracy, but rather were part of the lower knightly class, was a common phenomenon that is often forgotten when discussing medieval history. Imagine being a knight with a title and land in your hands, but your life is far from luxurious. In the Middle Ages, a knight, even if he owned a castle or vast lands, often faced numerous financial difficulties: high taxes, obligations to his lord or king, the need to maintain an army and maintain status. All this imposed a serious burden on the knight's income. Often such knights could not afford the privileges that seemed normal for more high-profile aristocrats. The castle in which he lived required constant expenses for repairs and maintenance. In addition, the costs of equipment, weapons, horses, and military campaigns were colossal. As a result, many knights found themselves in debt, or were forced to rent out part of their lands. A life of fighting might seem respectable, but for most knights it was associated with real poverty. They often lost their lands due to high taxes or unfulfilled obligations to more powerful feudal lords. Many knights were in a position where even the smallest expenses of daily life became a problem. Unusual, expensive maneuvers, such as participation in tournaments or military campaigns, often cost knights all their savings, making them dependent on their kings or more powerful feudal lords. Knights who failed to earn enough money from their lands could face real financial difficulties. To cover their living expenses, they were forced to borrow from richer ones, which often led to debts and dependencies. This could lead to the loss of title, lands, and even reputation. In some cases, knights were forced to sell part of their land or give it up to pay off debts, which ruined them and made it impossible for them to continue living as knights. But beyond the external costs of maintaining a knightly title, internal moral and psychological hardships also became an integral part of life. The life of a knight who could not afford comfort and lost his land often became torture. He could face social isolation, a sense of shame for his inability to provide for his family and maintain his position in society. And even if he did not lose his title and land, many knights could not truly enjoy them, since every day was associated with a struggle for survival, physically, socially, and financially. Knights who found themselves in poverty were in a difficult situation. This experience was not the exception, but rather the rule for many knights who could not maintain the opulent lifestyle of higher-ranking feudal lords. This sense of constant struggle for existence, to maintain one's dignity and title, became the norm for knights of the lower ranks. For most knights, true glory and wealth were not something ordinary, but an idealized image that they dreamed of but could never achieve. Knights, despite their pride and glory, often lived in poverty, hiding their weakness and fatigue under heavy armor. These problems remained a part of knightly life, which few thought about when admiring their feats and courage. Knighthood in the Middle Ages was not an easy achievement, and the path to it was long, thorny, and sometimes extremely difficult. For most people born into poverty, becoming a knight was an unattainable dream. However, for those who decided to take this path, becoming a knight could be not only a long process, but also full of social, moral, and economic difficulties. Imagine you were a young man born into a peasant family. You have no land, no wealth, no titles. But you dream of becoming a knight, someone who will fight on the battlefield, wear armor, and be recognized. Becoming a knight in such a situation was not just an ambitious goal, but also a real social feat. It all started with the fact that you had to become a squire, but before you could count on joining the ranks of knights, you had to go through a long path of training and trials, many of which began at a young age. The path that every knight took began in childhood. From a very early age, even if you were the son of a poor peasant, your education was purely physical. Your first lessons were not in writing and reading, but in the art of wielding weapons, as well as in learning discipline and endurance. A child who aspired to become a knight could not afford to dream of a carefree childhood. From the very beginning, his life was dedicated to serving his master, initially as a squire, and later, perhaps, as a knight. But the path to knighthood was not only difficult, it was expensive. Every young man who aspired to become a knight had to be able to afford equipment, gear, and training. For most, this was a financial burden they could not afford. Many knights only gained their titles and rights through the support of their overlords, the higher-ranking feudal lords. Their training was often supported through stipends or extra earnings, and titles came only after much testing and service on the battlefield. For a knight who was forced to seek employment or apprenticeship as a teenager, The world of medieval feudal society was a place where social status was of the utmost importance, and unless you were born into a noble family, achieving knighthood was nearly impossible. The game at the top of the feudal world was brutal, and for those who weren't in the right place at the right time, becoming a knight was an elusive dream. A knight, even if he was of the lower ranks of the aristocracy, also faced serious social problems. He had to consider not only his personal honor and military prowess, but also his relationships with higher-ranking feudal lords, political players, and even the church. Often, a knight had to find ways to please his social group and be loyal to his ruler or master, even if it conflicted with his own principles, in order to maintain his status. Competition between knights was also fierce. Each knight sought to conquer more lands and privileges, and often had to fight not only on the battlefield, but also in political games. This struggle was not always fair. Many knights resorted to intrigue, bribery, or even betrayal to achieve an increase in their status. Internal conflicts among knights were also common, which brought additional stress to the life of a knight who, despite his military prowess, found himself in the center of cruel political games. In addition, knights of the lower classes often faced serious economic instability. The lands they owned often did not generate enough income to support their status. And although knights could not afford to relax, even their physical health was at risk. Problems with nutrition, disease, and the harsh living conditions in castles and fortresses only worsened their situation, and they, despite their military strength, were often vulnerable socially and economically. Moreover, knights who achieved nobility faced the harsh reality that they were caught in a constant struggle for power and influence. It was not just a war on the battlefield, but also a war on the social front, where every move and every decision could be decisive for the future of their family and titles. Even if a knight achieved some success, his position was always at risk, as the system of feudal relations could change dramatically, and land, title, or inheritance could be snatched away in the blink of an eye. Thus, the path to knighthood was not only long, but also full of difficulties. For most knights, this path was a continuation of hard work and fear, and not a guarantee of a successful future. It was not just a path to glory, but also to financial difficulties, internal conflicts, and social ills that shaped the knight's life, despite his titles and external privileges. When a knight becomes a commander in battle, his role goes beyond that of a mere warrior. He no longer simply fights on the battlefield, but is responsible for the lives of his soldiers, for strategy, for the success or failure of the entire campaign. This is the burden of leadership, not just commanding an army, but also the weight of the moral and emotional decisions that determine the outcome of battles. While soldiers follow orders, the knight commander is obliged to make decisions that can lead to victory or disaster. This is not just a physical battle, but also an intellectual battle, where each choice can cost the lives of many. Imagine you are a knight commander standing on a battlefield, surrounded by your army. This is not just another skirmish with the enemy. This is a massive battle where the stakes are high. The future of your men, your honor, and your reputation. You stand there, feeling the excitement, knowing that every decision you make has huge consequences. You cannot afford to miss. Every order must be given with the confidence that it will lead to victory, or at least to minimizing losses. But it is not always so simple. In war, the morale of the army becomes an important factor, and even if you have the strength and weapons, it does not guarantee victory. Fatigue, hunger, disease, all these factors that can greatly affect the outcome of the battle are at your disposal. Not only are you fighting the enemy, but with each day that drags on your campaign, with every doubt that appears among your soldiers. Their faith in your ability to lead them to victory is what must maintain their fighting spirit. And although you may be an experienced warrior, your task now is to be a psychologist, a strategist, and a leader who inspires. Along with this comes another burden, the responsibility for the lives of your men. Your soldiers, your knights, they obey you, and your decisions directly affect their fates. Every battle is not only a chance to win, but also an opportunity to lose loved ones. With each fall of your friend or comrade in arms, you feel your soul grow heavy. These losses will be with you even if you win, but you can never afford weakness. Your army must not see your fear. They must see confidence and determination. Another difficult task that a commander faces is the choice between cruelty and mercy. On the battlefield, a knight had to uphold a code of honor, but what if victory requires not only strength, but also cruelty? Sometimes, to avoid a great sacrifice, you have to make a choice that contradicts the ideals of chivalry. For example, when capturing a city, you need to decide what to do with prisoners. Simple mercy can jeopardize your strategy, while cruelty can bring victory, but entail moral consequences that will haunt you for a long time. Many knights face this difficult choice throughout their careers as commanders. How do you maintain honor in war? How do you be fair and merciful without losing the war? These questions had no easy answers, and in real war, many knights made difficult decisions that left a mark on their souls. In addition, in battles, the knight commander had to take into account the entire strategic picture: how to distribute forces, what positions to take, where to send reinforcements. If the war dragged on, the commander had to organize supplies and treatment, prepare his people for long battles. And also, the army commander had to take into account the morale of his soldiers so that they did not lose faith in victory and did not run away or rebel. When the war ended, the knight commander often faced another difficult reality: returning home. After a battle, he could not simply relax. He had to continue to deal with the political, economic, and social issues associated with the consequences of victory or defeat. The life of a knight, always filled with battles, did not end on the battlefield. The knight commander often became part of political games, developing strategies and alliances to maintain peace or to continue to conquer and expand territory. Thus, leading an army on the battlefield was one of the most difficult and multifaceted tests for a knight. He did not simply fight. He made decisions that could save or destroy lives. Being a leader on the battlefield meant constantly bearing responsibility, being in the spotlight, fighting for the survival of his men, and perhaps going against his own moral principles if the situation required it. It was a path filled with difficult choices and internal conflicts, and not every knight could bear the burden. When the battle is over, the victors rejoice. But for the knight returning from the battlefield, victory brings not only glory and pride, but also a huge number of questions, difficulties, and even inner fear. Victory does not always mean the end of the struggle. On the contrary, it can be the beginning of an even more difficult path, a path in which the knight faces the consequences of his decisions, losses, and inevitable moral dilemmas. Imagine that you are a knight returning victorious. Your soldiers are jubilant, but for you, despite the triumph, the long and painful process of understanding what happened begins. You stand on the battlefield, surveying the battlefield, strewn with the bodies of the fallen. Even if your squad is victorious, thoughts of fallen friends and comrades, of the people you failed to save, begin to torment your mind. Victory on the battlefield will ultimately bring you not only awards and titles, but also memories of those you lost, of those you failed to protect. Many knights who returned victorious felt a deep emotional void. Yes, they had won the battle, but that did not mean the war was over. Victory in one battle did not guarantee long-term success. It did not relieve the moral burden, did not reduce the number of casualties, did not erase the memories of terrible battles. When everything seemed over, the knight was faced with another reality: the consequences of his decisions. War was not only a physical battle, but also a moral struggle. After the battles came the difficult process of dealing with those who survived, with those who needed to be rewarded or punished. Victory did not always mean unanimous agreement with the result. For some, it was a loss of honor; for others, moral torture. After battles, knights often had to return to their castles and organize further actions. Knights were not only warriors, but also politicians, and their duty was not only to fight, but also to restore order after the battle. Many knights became responsible for rebuilding devastated lands, helping to restore order and normal life for peasants and locals. In addition to all this, there were questions of strategy: how to prevent the enemy from returning soon, how to strengthen their positions, how to prepare the army for the next challenges. In addition, victors often faced the problem of political consequences. Victory in battle could become the beginning of new battles, both with internal opponents and with external ones. Knights returning home after victory had to begin the process of integrating the acquired territories, building political alliances, and taking part in diplomatic negotiations, which put them in a new and often no less dangerous role. But even if the knight was not involved in further military action, he faced another problem: rebuilding his reputation. After the brutal battles, losses, and moral sacrifices, the knight could feel a loss of inner harmony. Victory on the battlefield did not bring the satisfaction that many expected. The knight who won the battle often felt that he had left a part of himself on the battlefield. Returning home did not mean peace and rest. Rather, it was a return to reality, where questions of honor, morality, and obligation remained paramount. Victory might not be final either. Defeated enemies might seek revenge. Other powers might rise up. And all those ideals the knight had tried to defend might be called into question again. Moral duty continued, and knights often felt constant pressure to balance their personal principles with their duties. It is impossible to ignore the painful health consequences of the victors. The injuries sustained during battles did not disappear with victory. Many knights, despite their success in battle, remained permanently crippled, suffered from chronic pain or physical limitations. These injuries, like moral torment, became part of their lives, and victories could not erase these traces. A knight returning victorious often did not have the opportunity to enjoy this triumph to the fullest, because his body and soul were still experienced and changed by the war. Thus, victory, despite its importance, was not an end, but a new stage, full of inevitable consequences. The full weight of victory fell on the knight in the form of new responsibilities, moral dilemmas, and questions that required further efforts. This uncertainty of victory often remained with the knight throughout his life. The role of religion in the life of a medieval knight was extremely important, but not always simple. Knights, fighting for their kingdoms and lords, were often also defenders of the faith, especially during the Crusades and religious wars. But how could a knight reconcile his religious duty with the cruelty inherent in war? How could one be a faithful defender of Christianity while participating in bloody battles? This internal conflict was part of the reality of a knight who was obliged not only to fight enemies on the battlefield, but also to observe religious laws and morals. Imagine that you are a knight in the Middle Ages, dedicating your life to defending the Christian faith. Your army fights on sacred ground, and your duty is not just to win, but to fulfill God's will by defending the Holy Land from the infidels. However, as you carry out your duty, faced with the brutality of war and violence, you cannot help but wonder how this relates to your religious beliefs. The Knight's Code requires you to show courage and honor, but war demands destruction, violence, and death. For a knight, religion was not just a tool for moral support, but also an important element of his obligations. In this context, knights often took part in religious rituals and ceremonies, seeking to purify their souls before entering battle. Many knights believed that their participation in war, whether defending their lands or participating in crusades, was a divine duty. They often sought justification for their actions in religious institutions, finding comfort in the fact that they were fighting not just for power, but for a holy cause. However, a knight fighting on the battlefield faced the fact that war, filled with violence, destruction, and cruelty, could not always be justified by religious beliefs. How could the death of innocent people be justified when the Christian code taught forgiveness, mercy, and love? This internal conflict was part of the knight's existence. Often knights experienced guilt after a battle, especially if they took part in brutal acts of violence, such as massacres or the destruction of entire settlements. They could try to atone for their sins through prayer or pilgrimages, hoping that their actions were justified by greater religious goals. An important part of the knight's religious life was also his devotion to the church. The knight was obliged to protect the interests of the church and follow its commandments, which meant not only serving in military campaigns, but also participating in the defense of religious values and institutions. The church, in turn, provided the knights with spiritual support, sanctioning their participation in wars and providing justification for their cruel actions. In the case of the Crusades, the knights often received the blessing and even support of the Pope, which allowed them to feel their mission as sacred and noble. However, as comforting as this may sound, the knight himself could not always remain free from moral torment. He had to contend not only with external enemies, but also with his own feelings of guilt and doubts, especially when his actions on the battlefield went against his own religious beliefs. After each battle, the knight often sought forgiveness by visiting a church, praying and making sacrifices to cleanse his soul and gain forgiveness for the sacrifices he made and the crimes he committed for the glory of war. Ultimately, the knight's religious life was not only a matter of loyalty and service to God, but also a daily struggle to maintain moral and spiritual balance. Throughout his life, the knight faced difficult moral decisions, and every choice he made in battle was tied to his religious commitment and inner moral obligations. War and religion were intertwined for the knight, creating a complex and often torturous dynamic between duty, personal moral conviction, and the quest for salvation. Not all knights could find peace in this internal conflict. Some knights found peace in their long service, while others, having endured the ordeals of war, were never freed from feelings of guilt. A knight's religious life was a constant struggle for his honor and soul, and although many considered themselves servants of God, the question of whether their actions were justified in light of their faith remained important and painful for them. The age of chivalry as we know it was approaching its decline. Knights, once the embodiment of valor, honor, and courage, began to lose their role in military conflict. Changes in military technology, the rise of centralized states, and new political realities meant that knightly orders and their struggle for territory became less important, and the institution of chivalry itself lost its former significance. Imagine that you are a knight standing on the edge of your order, which was once powerful and important, but is now beginning to lose its influence and respect. In a world where you were once a symbol of strength and honor, you now feel that the knightly orders are losing popularity, and their methods and military skills are no longer as effective. New military technologies such as firearms, arquebuses, and cannons were becoming more common, displacing the traditional methods of knights on horseback, which were considered less effective against armies armed with firearms. Instead of knights whose maneuvers in battle were based on disciplined charges with heavy swords and lances, armies needed more mobile and flexible soldiers armed with firearms who could operate with much greater range and accuracy. Many knights whose skills were primarily in sword and lance combat now found themselves helpless on the battlefield, where their armor was less useful and the weight of their weapons made it difficult to maneuver and adapt to new tactics. The knight's time on the battlefield was over. The emergence of new types of troops, such as pikemen, musketeers, and artillery, reduced the importance of the knight, whose fighting abilities were no longer relevant. Only shadows of the glorious knightly orders remained, and chivalry was becoming a symbol that no longer reflected real military and political power. However, changes in the military sphere were not the only factor contributing to the decline of knighthood. The knightly orders, which had once been so powerful and influential, also faced internal problems. It was becoming increasingly difficult to cope with the growing feudal states, centralized monarchies, and economic changes. Knights who had previously been an integral part of the political and social structure of Europe now found it difficult to maintain their old privileges and status. Elements of the feudal world gradually gave way to more centralized and structured states, where knights could no longer play a decisive role in governance or defense. These changes also affected the financial side of knighthood. Maintaining a knightly order or army required large expenses, and not every knight could afford the luxury of war in times of economic crisis. The lands that had previously been the knight's main source of income became less profitable due to increased taxes, changes in agricultural policy, and demographic changes. Knights who were unable to secure sufficient income to support their titles often found themselves in poverty or were forced to hand over their lands to others. In addition, the social role of knights began to change. In times of prosperity, knights were not only warriors, but also the elite of society, performing important political, religious, and cultural functions. However, with the development of cities, the expansion of trade networks, and the strengthening of central monarchies, knights began to lose their privileged position. New economic and political realities required other forms of leadership and organization that could support changes in society. Many knights, finding themselves in these changing conditions, tried to adapt to the new demands, but in most cases they were unable to maintain their power. The knightly orders that had previously ruled vast lands and people became weak and helpless in the face of modern military and political systems. Thus, chivalry as a social phenomenon gradually died out, giving way to more organized and effective forms of government and army. Yet, despite the decline of traditional chivalry, its legacy endured. The image of the knight as a symbol of honor and valor continued to inspire generation after generation. Knightly orders, though they had lost their original power, remained important symbols of nobility and moral strength, and the ideals of chivalry continued to inspire later literature, art, and culture. The knight as an archetype continued to exist in myths, legends, and stories, even as the knight's actual role on the battlefield became a thing of the past. Eventually, chivalry as a social institution was absorbed by the development of newer and more powerful structures, but the legacy of chivalry remained, and it was not only a military legacy, but also a cultural one. Knights became symbols of ideals that, despite the changing eras, continued to inspire people for centuries. As chivalry began to decline, its decline not only symbolized the end of an era, but also the transition to entirely new social and political structures that would fundamentally change the map of Europe. While the knightly orders and traditions gradually disappeared, the legacy of chivalry continued to influence subsequent generations, leaving an indelible mark on history. Although knights and their armor became archaic in the context of military technology, their ideals and symbols survived their time and remained important in cultural and social life. Imagine being the last knight standing in the dark corridors of an old castle, watching as the old orders and traditions fade away, giving way to new times. The chivalric code that once defined the knight's life begins to seem old-fashioned, and his role in society is gradually disappearing. New armies, new political systems, and finally the emergence of nation-states with centralized power have changed the world in which the knight was at the pinnacle of the social and political hierarchy. With the development of firearms and changes in combat tactics, knightly orders became ineffective. Serious military technology, such as cannons and muskets, pushed heavily armed knights out of the battlefield. Soon, knights lost their importance as a military force. The battles in which they once shone became less significant, and their place was taken by more modern armies equipped with firearms and artillery. Knights as personal warriors lost their importance. Their role in military conflicts was reduced to a minimum. But despite the loss of their former importance on the battlefield, the knightly orders continued to exert influence in cultural and social life. The knightly code of honor, the ideals of courage and valor, duty and loyalty to one's lord remained important in culture. Knights became symbols of virtue, nobility, and self-sacrifice. Many of them continued to remain in history as role models. In literature and art, knights became the embodiment of those ideals that, although they had lost their relevance in real life, continued to live in myths and legends. In the 16th and 17th centuries, knighthood in its old form became a thing of the past, but its legacy lived on in more peaceful forms. Knightly orders often evolved into cultural and charitable organizations, unrelated to military service. This was the era of knights as judges, benefactors, diplomats, and patrons of the arts. They continued to serve society, but now in a peaceful sphere, not on the battlefield. Moreover, the knightly legacy lived on in tradition and ceremony. The transition from the old knighthood to new forms of aristocracy did not mean the complete disappearance of the ideals of knighthood. For example, in European countries, the traditions of knighthood continued to exist as symbolic institutions. Many monarchs and aristocrats who took the title of knight continued to support the idea of nobility, honor, and service to their people, even if this no longer had a direct relationship to military action. Knightly orders continued to exist in the form of social and charitable organizations, where rituals and ceremonies recalled what had once been an integral part of a knight's life. In history, knights have become a symbol not only of the past, but also of an idea that has never disappeared: the idea of honor, courage, bravery, and the willingness to serve a higher duty than personal interests. Knightly valor, embedded in the culture of the Middle Ages, has had a significant impact on the creation of ideals that have become the basis of many modern societies. By the time chivalry had lost its power and influence in the political and military spheres, it had become a cultural phenomenon that continued to inspire generations of people. In literature, theater, art, and philosophy, knights remained objects of admiration and symbols of purity and courage, and their exploits were part of national myths and traditions. Thus, even though knights no longer fought on the battlefield, their legacy lived on, and chivalric ideals became the basis for new social structures. In this context, the decline of chivalry is not only the loss of old forms, but also the beginning of a new era in which the values embodied by knights were preserved, albeit in a modified form. Chivalry ended as a military institution, but continued to exist as a powerful cultural symbol, inspiring for many centuries. Knightly tournaments were an important part of knightly life in the Middle Ages. They were not only sporting events, but also important social and political events that allowed knights to demonstrate their valor, skill, and strength. as well as strengthen their position in society and provide an opportunity to strengthen social and political ties. Tournaments became one of the most important traditions of chivalry and played an important role in the formation of the knightly ideal, which, despite changes in military strategy and weaponry, remained popular even in the late Middle Ages. Knightly tournaments began their history in the 11th century, when knights returning from military campaigns organized competitions to maintain their physical fitness and military skills. These early tournaments were far from their modern forms and were more of a training event than an organized competition. Gradually, such events began to develop and acquire a more formal form. From the late 12th century, especially during the Crusades, tournaments became more popular and organized, and they became important not only for demonstrating military skills, but also as a means of socialization and political play. The emergence of new forms of competition, such as the jeremy, group battles, and one-on-one duels, cavalry tournament or tospara, gave tournaments a more structured and cultural character. These events became an important part of knightly life, where each knight could demonstrate his skill and bravery. The knightly tournament was not just a sporting event, but was often perceived as a way to demonstrate knightly honor, courage, and devotion to a code of honor. Before participating in the tournament, a knight had to take an oath, confirming his commitment to the rules of the game and honor. Tournaments also served as an opportunity for knights to enhance their reputation. Tournament winners were respected and could receive recognition not only from their peers, but also from higher-ranking aristocrats. Tournaments were also an important opportunity to demonstrate knightly virtue, especially for young knights who wanted to prove their valor and abilities. At times, a tournament became a test for knights, and even a small mistake could lead to disgrace and loss of reputation. Tournaments were not limited to competitions. They became important social events where knights, aristocrats, and representatives of the upper classes gathered. It was a kind of public spectacle where knights could show not only their fighting skills, but also their ability to behave in society. Tournaments served as a platform for concluding political and personal agreements. Noble ladies also played an important role in the tournament, rewarding the winners and paying them attention. For kings and princes, tournaments were an important element in creating and maintaining political connections. They were places where knights could gain the patronage of higher aristocrats or gain new career opportunities. In addition, tournaments served as an important means of strengthening the honor and prestige of their houses and feudal lords. There are several types of knightly tournaments, each of which has its own characteristics and goals. Tospar, one of the earliest types of tournament, consisting of mass battles between two large groups of knights. They were usually semi-formal combat competitions, the purpose of which was to demonstrate physical strength and teamwork. Individual fights. These tournaments were already more disciplined. Knights fought one-on-one, using spears and swords. These were brutal duels, the goal of which was either to win or to cause serious damage to the opponent. The winners often became heroes, and their names were recorded in the chronicles. Spear tournament, jeremy, a special form of tournament in which two knights fought on horseback with lances. This competition required not only skill in handling a lance, but also excellent riding. Winning such a tournament could significantly increase the status of a knight in the eyes of society. Sword tournament. Most often these were sword fights with more limited rules, with the aim of testing not only physical strength, but also weapon handling techniques. These tournaments could be less dangerous to the health of the participants, but still left quite serious marks on the knights' bodies. Tournaments also served as an important tool for knights to prepare for real battles. These events gave them the opportunity to practice their skills in combat conditions without having to take part in a real war. Participation in a tournament allowed a knight to improve his physical fitness, test his reflexes and maneuvers, and strengthen his morale. In addition, tournaments became an important part of military culture, in which a knight had to combine physical training with moral and strategic skills. Knightly tournaments played an important role in shaping the cultural heritage of the Middle Ages. They inspired legends, songs, and epics, such as the famous novels about the Knights of the Round Table. Becoming part of the knightly ideal, tournaments became a symbol of courage, fortitude, and knightly honor, which continues to be reflected in modern culture. The myth of knightly tournaments as a symbol of the ideal of chivalry has remained with us, and we can still see it in books, films, and other forms of art, where knights are often depicted as heroes, ready to go through any difficulties for the sake of honor and glory. Although knights were primarily known for their military exploits on the battlefield, their lives in peacetime were also important and multifaceted. When wars and battles died down, knights could not afford to relax. Their role in society was not only military, but also social, political, and cultural. In peacetime, knights continued to be an important part of feudal society, despite the lack of constant wars and battles. One of the main duties of a knight in peacetime was to manage his own lands. Many knights owned large fiefs that they had to cultivate, manage, and protect. This was not an easy task, as the knight was obliged to monitor the welfare of his peasants, collecting taxes from them, and ensuring their protection from external threats. The life of a knight in peacetime often resembled the life of a feudal lord who was responsible for his estate, and therefore had to actively engage in economic affairs. Knights often spent time in their castles, managing their lands, educating peasants, and protecting them from possible raids. Castles, despite their strategic role in defense, also served as administrative centers where local politics and economics were decided. Knights were expected to be not only warriors, but also wise landowners, organizing work processes on their lands and resolving conflicts among peasants or local residents. Although knights were primarily known for their military prowess, an important part of their lives in peacetime was also their status in society, which was maintained through adherence to the knightly code of honor. A knight had to maintain his reputation and set an example of virtue, honesty, and nobility, even if he did not have to fight in war. Family obligations played an important role in the life of a knight. He was obliged to protect the interest of his family and legacy, which often included marriage alliances and raising children in the spirit of the chivalric code. In times of peace, knights often married for political and social reasons, seeking to strengthen their position in society, as well as to provide their heirs with titles and lands. The education of children in a knightly family was an important aspect of their upbringing, and sons typically began their training at an early age, preparing to become knights and continue the family tradition. Knights played an important role not only on the battlefield, but also in politics and diplomacy. In times of peace, many of them became advisors, diplomats, or even managers of feudal lands. They maintained connections with other aristocrats and even kings, often participating in the conclusion of political agreements, trade deals, and other important social affairs. Knights who owned lands often took part in local and even royal affairs, holding positions in government, becoming judges, or appointed civil servants. Sometimes knights carried out important missions to collect taxes or provide services in state affairs. Thus, despite the absence of war, knights remained important players in the social and political life of their time. In addition to military and administrative duties, knights also played an important role in the cultural and spiritual life of society. Knights were often patrons of the arts, supporting art, literature, and architecture. In times of peace, many knights participated in the construction of castles, monasteries, and other architectural monuments, and supported philosophical and religious institutions. The spiritual life of a knight was an integral part of his existence. Knights took part in religious festivals, made pilgrimages, and supported the church in its charitable endeavors. Knights often went to monasteries for spiritual reflection or prayer, especially after participating in fierce battles to cleanse their souls of sins. Church events and holidays became an important part of the social life of knights, strengthening their morale and ensuring adherence to the knightly code of honor. During times of peace, knights also actively participated in sporting and cultural events such as tournaments, hunting, and horse riding. Tournaments became an important tradition, allowing knights not only to maintain their physical fitness, but also to demonstrate their valor and skill. Although tournaments are often associated with military exploits, they also became important events for knights to demonstrate their skills, social status, and connections. Hunting, as a form of entertainment and training, was also a popular activity among knights. It required skill in horsemanship and archery, as well as dedication to the art of hunting, which was an important aspect of knightly training. The life of a knight in peacetime was full of duties not directly related to war, but still required great effort, loyalty, and moral fortitude. Knights continued to play a key role in politics, culture, and society, maintaining order and strengthening their position in the feudal system. Their lives were filled with obligations that required attention, strategic thinking, and the ability to solve problems unrelated to battle. Thus, despite the absence of war, the knight continued to be an important figure in society, fulfilling not only the role of a protector, but also a political and cultural leader. In times of peace, his life was connected with caring for his family, fulfilling political duties, and maintaining his reputation, which ultimately became the basis of the knightly way of life. Medieval knights are often associated with images of noble heroes seeking to win the hearts of beautiful ladies, fighting for their honor and love. This is a romantic ideal that continues to inspire literature and art. However, the reality of knightly relationships with women was much more complex and less idealized than the images we are accustomed to seeing in fairy tales and knightly epics. One of the most famous aspects of chivalry is the cult of love, linked to the knightly code of honor. In chivalric literature, beginning with the romances of the Round Table, knights were portrayed as heroes who would do anything for their ladies. The legends of King Arthur and Lancelot, Tristan and Isolde, Parsifal, and other heroes extol the idealized love that becomes the driving force for knights. However, it is worth noting that this knightly love was more of a cultural concept than a real reflection of a relationship. Knights were often obliged to serve ladies, showing them respect, loyalty, and admiration. But this admiration was more a manifestation of social status and adherence to the knightly code than real affection. The woman was a symbol of virtue that the knight had to protect, and this protection was not only physical, but also spiritual. A wife or lady could be the object of knightly devotion and her honor, the main incentive for performing knightly deeds. Knights were obliged to compete for the love of ladies, but these relationships were often limited to ceremonial politeness and ritual norms, reflecting the social role of women rather than personal feelings. In real life, knights were probably not the idealized heroes they were portrayed as in literature. The women they had relationships with were often symbolic rather than equal partners. Women in the Middle Ages were generally under male rule, and their social status depended on their father, husband, or other relative. Knights often married women from aristocratic families, but these marriages were more political and economic unions than romantic ones. The chivalric code instructed knights to protect the honor of ladies and ensure their safety, but this protection did not necessarily mean real emotional attachment. An important goal for a knight was to strengthen his social position through marriage alliances. These unions were a way to acquire lands, titles, and political influence. In addition, a knight could have not only one wife, but also mistresses, which was a common practice among noblemen of the time. In real life, knights were expected to demonstrate their bravery and valor by protecting ladies. But in most cases, this did not involve deep personal relationships as depicted in the novels. Ladies in real life often had no right to make independent decisions in relationships. And even if knights fought for their honor, these battles were more a matter of social role and obligation than of real romantic passion. However, it should be noted that there were stories of real love affairs among knights that were immortalized, such as the love of the knight Tristan and the lady Isolde, where love became not only a theme for poetry, but also a moment of tragic fate. However, such stories usually reflected either an aristocratic position or an ideal that could not be fully realized in real life. Serious emotional relationships between a knight and a lady could exist, but their impact on society was limited, as the feudal structure and social norms constrained the freedom of personal relationships. Knights' relationships with women depended largely on their status in society. Women generally remained under the authority of men, whether their husbands, fathers, or other men in the family. Knights often gained political and economic advantage by marrying women from aristocratic families. But these relationships were primarily power relationships. If a knight occupied a high social status, his relationships with women were less an expression of romance and more a reflection of political strategies. Knights had many obligations to their lord and society, and marriages were often made to strengthen their position in the aristocratic circle. Women in these relationships were often objects, used to strengthen social and economic ties. Additionally, in the Middle Ages, knights could enter into relationships with the lower classes of society, such as peasant women or even widows from poor families, which could also lead to the creation of complex, but often unequal and informal, relationships. Chivalric literature portrayed women as pure, beautiful, and virtuous beings, whom the knight was supposed to protect and adore. However, the reality was different. In real life, knights often could not afford such idealistic attachments, especially in politically motivated marriages. Women played an important role in chivalric romances as symbols of purity and valor, but their real lives and social positions often did not match this idealized image. In literature, such as the romances of the Knights of the Round Table, knights performed heroic deeds for the ladies, which was actually a reflection of the social ideal of the era. While knights demonstrated their loyalty and honor, women were more passive participants in these stories than equal partners in the relationship. The idealized images of knights and women that we see in romance and legend often do not correspond to the reality of the Middle Ages. Although knights could fight for the ladies, their relationships with women were complex, and often they were guided by social and political obligations rather than personal feelings. Women in knightly society often played the role of symbols of virtue and honor, but their position in real life was much more limited. Chivalric culture created an image that became the basis for literary and cultural traditions, but the real relationships of knights with women were not nearly as romantic as we often imagine. Knightly culture was not only an important social institution of the Middle Ages, but also a powerful driver of cultural change. Through literature, art, and architecture, knights left behind a legacy that continues to inspire generations. Their ideals, which were closely linked to a code of honor, bravery, and loyalty, were reflected in works of art, music, and even architecture of the time. One of the most significant features of knightly culture was its literature, which promoted the ideals of chivalry, such as valor, loyalty, and bravery. It is believed that in the Middle Ages, literature about knights played an important role in the education of knights, as well as in the formation of the social image of the aristocracy. Chivalric literature often depicted knights as heroes who undertook difficult tasks or fought for the honor of ladies and the defense of their faith. These included romantic stories such as the Romance of Tristan and Isolde, the Romance of the Knights of the Round Table, including stories of King Arthur and his knights, and epics of duels, battles, and great deeds. These works became the basis for the chivalric ideal, which was widely disseminated and continues to inspire literary works about heroism and love. A special place in chivalric literature is occupied by novels about maps and quests, such as The Romance of Parsifal or The Quests of the Knights of the Holy Grail. These works became not only fascinating stories, but also conductors of moral lessons, showing the importance of loyalty, purity, and fearlessness. Through these literary works, knights learned to maintain their reputation, observe the code of honor, and defend their honor on the battlefield and in society. Knightly poetry and music occupied an important place in the cultural life of the Middle Ages. Knights not only fought, but also became patrons of art. Troubadours, poets and musicians of that time, created works dedicated to knightly love, valor, and glory. Music and poetry became a way to express the feelings of a knight, his loyalty to his lady, as well as the experiences associated with military campaigns and battles. Love was generally depicted as pure, sublime, and self-sacrificing. Chivalric poetry celebrated not only love for a lady, but also the relationship between a knight and his lord, as well as the ideals of loyalty and nobility. Troubadours often became important figures in aristocratic circles, and their poems were recited at feasts and celebrations, which contributed to the spread of chivalric ideals and their popularization in society. In addition to the troubadours, the minnesingers in Germany also performed songs dedicated to love, chivalry, and glory. These poets performed their works on musical instruments, accompanying the words with gentle melodies. These songs served not only for entertainment, but also to shape public opinion about knights and their virtues. The poetry of knights became an important element of the cultural heritage that supported the knightly way of life in the eyes of society. Knightly culture was also reflected in architecture. One of the most visible symbols of knighthood were castles, which not only served as places of residence for knights, but also became important fortifications for the protection of their lands and peasants. Castles were important administrative centers that symbolized the power, honor, and wealth of the knight. Castles of the time were built in strategic locations, often on high ground or near rivers, allowing for control of the area. Castle architecture was generally practical and functional. Thick stone walls, watchtowers, deep moats, and battlements created defensive structures that kept knights and their families safe. However, castles were not only military objects, they were also centers of knightly culture, where celebrations, tournaments, and feasts were held. Many castles were decorated with frescoes, tapestries, stained glass windows, and even the creation of their own libraries. This became a place where knights could engage in science, study the arts, and also maintain the cultural traditions of their time. Another important component of knightly culture was the art of heraldry, which developed in the Middle Ages. Heraldic signs, coats of arms, and emblems became an integral part of knightly life. Each knight or aristocrat had his own coat of arms, which reflected his social status, pedigree, and personality traits. Heraldic symbols were used on armor, shields, banners, and even buildings. It was not only a means of self-expression, but also a way to identify a knight on the battlefield. The variety of colors, shapes, and designs on coats of arms allowed the creation of a whole system of symbols that helped distinguish knights and their houses. In addition to heraldry, the knights actively supported creative activities, supporting artists, sculptors, and architects. The knights commissioned the creation of magnificent frescoes, sculptures, and stained glass windows, many of which depicted scenes of knightly exploits, historical events, and mythological motifs. Knightly culture had a huge impact on the development of art and culture in subsequent eras. Many elements of chivalry, such as romance, a code of honor, ideas of nobility, and respect for ladies, became the basis for the formation of social and cultural norms that passed into the Renaissance and even later times. Chivalric ideals inspired artists and writers, such as Chaucer and Shakespeare, to create works that represented important concepts, such as honor, valor, and loyalty. These ideals continued in later literature, including romances about knights, such as Cervantes' Don Quixote, and many other works, where knights remained symbols of the fight against injustice and the search for truth. Knightly culture had a profound influence on the art of the Middle Ages, creating a whole tradition of literature, music, architecture, and visual arts that continue to fascinate us today. Knights, as warriors as well as patrons of the arts, left a legacy that celebrates the ideals of honor, love, and loyalty that lives on in literature, film, and culture to this day. Knight's armor is not just an element of military equipment, but also a symbol of knightly valor and social status. It represents not only protection, but also art, since with the development of technology, art, and military strategies, armor became more complex and diverse. The evolution of knight's armor also reflected changes in the role of the knight, his place in society and military conflicts. In this segment, we take a detailed look at how knightly armor has changed over the centuries, from its first simple forms to the outstanding examples of the late Middle Ages. At the beginning of the age of chivalry, in the 9th and 10th centuries, armor was quite simple and modest. At that time, knights, like other warriors, used light armor, such as chainmail, a mesh of metal rings that was flexible, but at the same time provided decent protection from blows. Chainmail covered most of the body, including the torso, arms, and legs, but left parts of the body vulnerable, such as the head, face, and armpits. However, chainmail, although it protected against blows, was not ideal in protecting against more powerful attacks, such as blows from axes or swords. Therefore, knights used additional elements of protection, such as breastplates, helmets, and knee pads, which, in turn, gradually became more sophisticated. Helmets of the time, for example, were simple helmets that protected the head, but lacked modern comfort and visibility. They often had no eye holes or breathing holes, making them uncomfortable and hot during long battles. By the 12th and 13th centuries, with the growing importance of chivalry, armor began to evolve towards more protective and functional designs. This time was marked by the appearance of more complex and hardened protective elements, such as plate armor, which provided much greater protection than the chainmail. Plate armor was made up of individual metal plates that were attached to fabric or leather bases and placed on the body, protecting it from blows and damage. Plate armor provided the knight with much greater mobility and a higher degree of protection than chainmail, and it was ideal for fighting with swords, spears, and arrows. During this period, plate bracers and shoulder armor became important elements, protecting the limbs, while the shield remained the main means of protection from blows in battle. From the 14th century onwards, knightly armor began to undergo even greater changes, becoming increasingly sophisticated and technologically advanced. At this time, new forms and types of armor appeared, oriented towards combating firearms and more powerful weapons, such as cannons and crossbows. Full armor, which protected the knight from head to toe, became the standard for military and aristocratic knights. They were made of hard iron or steel that could withstand blows from weapons and arrows, and were also made with more precise calculations to ensure maximum mobility and protection. Armor of this period included plates that covered the chest, back, limbs, and head. Helmets of this period were much more advanced. Unlike the previous ones, they were equipped with eye and breathing holes, as well as protection for the neck and chin. One of the most famous forms of helmets of that time, the pickelhaube, had a long neck guard and fit tightly to the face, providing good protection. In addition, new protective elements such as knee pads, gloves, and plate elbow pads became mandatory in a knight's armor set, providing complete protection for the entire body. By the 15th and 16th centuries, knightly armor had reached its apogee in terms of both protection and aesthetics. At this time, armor became not only functional, but also an object of art, being an expression of the knight's social status and financial position. Knight's armor. During this period, armor became more complex and decorative. They included carving, engraving, and gilding, which added an additional aesthetic element to the armor's design. Armor making became a real craft, where craftsmen created not only functional, but also beautiful items. However, with the rise of firearms, knights began to face new problems. The advent of pistols and cannons made armor less effective, as bullets could penetrate metal, making the continued use of knightly armor in combat questionable. Despite this, armor continued to be a symbol of knightly status, and knights often wore it for ceremonial events or tournaments. With the development of firearms in the 16th and 17th centuries, knightly armor began to lose its relevance on the battlefield. Armies armed with firearms defeated knights in armor more quickly and effectively. However, knightly armor did not disappear completely, and it continued to be used for peaceful purposes, such as participating in the tournaments, ceremonies, and holidays. Today, knights' armor continues to be symbols not only of the past, but also of the immortal ideals of chivalry. It is an integral part of historical museums and cultural heritage, and its evolution gives us an understanding of how the military and social structure of the Middle Ages developed. The evolution of knightly armor is not just a story about protection in battle, but also a story about the culture, technology, and aesthetics of the Middle Ages. From simple chainmail to complex and beautiful armored complexes, knights' armor was an important element, not only in military actions, but also in society. It symbolized not only physical protection, but also moral strength, honor, and status, which were important for the knights of the time. Knights, as historical and cultural figures, occupy an important place in different countries and cultures, and their role in society could vary significantly depending on the region, political system, and military tradition. While in Western Europe, knighthood became a symbol of honor and nobility, other cultures such as the Arab or Japanese developed similar but unique knightly traditions, such as the samurai or the mujahideen. In this segment, we will explore how knightly culture manifested itself in different countries and cultures, and what differences and similarities existed between them. In Western Europe, beginning in the early Middle Ages, knights became a symbol not only of military prowess, but also of cultural ideals. Unlike ordinary soldiers, knights had land, title, and social status. They served both as military forces, defending their kingdoms, and in politics, playing an important role in the governance of feudal lands. The Code of Chivalry, which regulated the knight's behavior, was based on the principles of honor, loyalty, courage, and protection of the weak, especially women and children. This code was a vital part of knightly life, where valor and honor were considered more important than victory on the battlefield. The idea of the knight as a defender of justice was reflected not only in military actions, but also in social and political life, where knights served the king and performed duties in local government. At the same time, knights in Western Europe actively participated in tournaments, which became not only entertainment, but also an important element for maintaining reputation and connections between different social classes. Japan developed its own chivalric tradition, which was as deeply rooted in the culture as European chivalry, but with a completely different philosophy and system. Samurai, Japanese warriors who followed the code of Bushido, were the military elite who served the feudal lords and emperors of Japan. Bushido, translated as the way of the warrior, required samurai to be loyal, disciplined, honorable, and selfless. This code regulated the behavior of the samurai both in battle and in everyday life, where honesty, respect, bravery, and responsibility to their lord were important aspects. Samurai not only fought on the battlefield, but also played an important role in Japanese society, taking part in governance, educating future generations, and maintaining public order. During times of peace, samurai were engaged in art, philosophy, and self-improvement. Swordmasters, for example, were engaged in perfecting the technique of wielding the katana, Japanese sword, which became not just an art, but also a spiritual practice. The Arab world also had military elites who, although not called knights, served similar functions. The mujahideen, warriors who fought in jihad, were defenders of faith and culture. These warriors fought not only against enemies on the battlefield, but also for the sacred ideals of Islam. The mujahideen's code of conduct was strict adherence to principles related to faith, honor, and loyalty to God. Although the mujahideen did not have the same social role as knights in Europe or samurai in Japan, their actions and moral code were at the center of Arab military culture. Fighting infidels, defending Islamic lands, and participating in holy wars, jihad, became important elements of military and social life. It is also worth noting that the mujahideen may have been members of military orders at one time, such as the Templars in the Crusades, with whom they fought numerous clashes for control of the Holy Land. India had its own unique system of chivalry, particularly in the Rajput culture. The Rajputs were renowned military aristocrats who owned lands and forts and fought for their honor and territorial rights. Although they did not follow the code of chivalry in the Western sense, their ideals of honor and bravery were similar to those of European knights. The Rajputs had their own traditions related to warfare, social structure, and religion. The most important element in their culture was dharma, duty and moral obligation, which prescribed loyalty to one's home and defense of one's homeland. Unlike European knights who fought for titles and wealth, the Rajputs often fought to defend their beliefs, their people, and their kingdom. The Rajputs also embodied the ideal of a warrior who was not only a strong fighter, but also a wise ruler, capable of managing the land and protecting it from external threats. The ideals of the Rajputs were close to the knightly traditions, but had their own unique basis in Indian culture. In Africa, there were also warriors who acted as knights in their societies, although they did not have the exact equivalent of the knightly system found in Europe or Japan. For example, the Askari warriors of the Aksumite Empire and later warriors from Ethiopia or Mali played an important role in defending their lands and strengthening national dignity. These warriors followed their own and tribal codes of honor, often defending their territories from outside invaders. In some parts of Africa, there were also military castes, such as the jihadists or conquering warriors in different parts of the continent, who sought to maintain their honor and defend their land, as knights did in other cultures. Chivalry, although associated with Western Europe, is a universal concept that can be traced across cultures around the world, from the knights of Europe to the samurai of Japan, from the mujahideen of the Arab world to the Rajputs of India. The ideals of honor, loyalty, and courage have occupied an important place in the lives of warriors around the world. Regardless of culture, knights have always been symbols of protection, strength, and morality, and their influence on historical processes remains significant. These varied forms of chivalry show how the cult of military prowess, honesty, and service to society has been important in all cultures, albeit with its own unique characteristics. The ideals embodied by knights in different countries continue to influence modern culture, from literature to cinema, inspiring us to create new heroic images. The Crusades are one of the most significant events of the Middle Ages, which had a profound impact on both the political and cultural landscape of the time. These holy wars, initiated by the Church to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims, were not only important for the religious and political authorities, but also a time of glory and testing for the knights who stood in the front ranks. In this segment, we will take a detailed look at how knights participated in the Crusades, what goals they pursued, and what impact these campaigns had on the development of chivalry, as well as on the culture and politics of the time. The Crusades began in the late 11th century when Pope Urban II called for Christian warriors to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims who controlled Jerusalem in 1095. Pope Urban II offered all believers, including knights, the opportunity to purify their souls and receive forgiveness for their sins in exchange for participating in a holy war. This call became the basis for the First Crusade, and it quickly attracted the attention of knights who were looking for a way to glorify their honor, as well as seeking spiritual purification and material gain. For knights, a crusade was not just a military expedition, but also an opportunity for them to gain land, wealth, and recognition. While participation in the Crusades was a religious duty, it also served as a social and political tool for knights. Participation in the Crusades enhanced their status in both society and church circles. It was a way to assert themselves on the international stage and to strengthen their reputation as defenders of the Christian faith. The Crusades were not only a physical, but also a moral test for the knights. They had to adhere to strict religious and military rules, which were regulated by the church code. When calling the knights to campaign, the church promised them forgiveness for sins and spiritual purification. However, the war against the Muslims was brutal, and many knights faced moral dilemmas on the battlefield, violating the knightly code, which required mercy and humanity, even in war. In addition, many knights on their way to the Holy Land found themselves involved in violence and cruelty that did not always correspond to the high ideal of chivalry. The battles with the Muslims were not only military clashes, but also ideological struggles in which religious fanaticism and politics were often intertwined. Many knights lost their original spiritual purpose, absorbed in violence and the struggle for territory and wealth. The Crusades played an important role in the development of knightly culture and society. During the Crusades, knights became part of a much larger international community, interacting with other knights and aristocrats from all over Christendom. This brought knights not only glory and wealth, but also opportunities to create new political and cultural ties. These connections and contacts between knights from different countries influenced the development of knightly brotherhood and the strengthening of the knightly ideal. The Crusades also brought about changes in the structure of knighthood. As the Crusades became longer and more numerous, knights began to organize themselves into more structured groups and interacted with other parts of society, such as merchants, monks, and even peasant rebellions. This contributed to the development of knightly orders such as the Templars, Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order, which played an important role in waging wars and governing conquered territories. Although the bulk of knightly participation in the Crusades involved combat, the role of women in the process was also significant. Women in the Middle Ages, especially in aristocratic families, often played key roles in managing estates and resources while their husbands were away on campaign. Not only did women maintain domestic life, but they were often the ones who directed and organized charitable and diplomatic efforts to support the Crusades. Women also participated in the Crusades as benefactors, often providing money and resources to finance the campaigns. They also played an important role in the Church's support of the Crusades, organizing prayers and providing spiritual support to the warriors. However, it is worth noting that women rarely took part in combat, as this was considered inappropriate for ladies of the time. After the Crusades ended, the knightly community experienced many changes. On the one hand, many knights returned with great wealth and status, and also created new orders, such as the Templars, which continued their influence on the political and financial life of Europe. On the other hand, the Crusades weakened the knights, as many of them died or lost their land and wealth. In addition, the Crusades accelerated cultural exchanges between the East and the West. A lot of knowledge, technology, and goods such as spices, fabrics, and medicines began to flow into Europe from the Middle East. This led to cultural prosperity, and was ultimately one of the reasons that led to the beginning of the Renaissance. The Crusades also brought about long-term changes in relations between the Christian and Muslim worlds, with consequences for relations between the countries in the following centuries. Muslims such as Saladin became heroes in the Arab world, and the Crusades left a deep mark on Christian perceptions of Islam. The Crusades were an important stage in the history of chivalry, shaping and changing both the culture itself and the role of knights in society. Participation in these campaigns meant for knights not only a physical struggle for the Holy Land, but also spiritual purification, and an opportunity to strengthen their position in the political and social context. The Crusades became a catalyst for many changes in Europe, both in culture and in the military sphere, leaving a deep mark on history and culture. Knightly orders, as organized military and religious associations, became the most important institutions in medieval Europe. These orders brought together knights who sought not only to defend the Christian faith, but also to uphold the ideals of chivalry, such as honor, loyalty, courage, and sacrifice. Knightly orders played a key role in the Crusades, politics, and social life of the time, and their influence continues to be felt in cultural heritage today. In this segment, we will take a detailed look at the major knightly orders, their origins, their role in history, and their importance as spiritual and military forces of the Middle Ages. Knightly orders arose at the intersection of two important factors: Christianity and the knightly military tradition. In the 12th century, when the Crusades became the most important part of Christian politics, there was a need for organized military groups that could not only defend Christian lands, but also serve as spiritual defenders of the faith. Initially, knights in these orders were required to follow strict religious vows, such as poverty, chastity, and obedience, as well as military duties to defend the Christian faith. This combination of spiritual and military duties created unique structures that differed significantly from traditional knightly and feudal groups. Order of St. John Hospitallers, also known as the Hospitallers, was founded in the late 11th century in Jerusalem. Their primary mission was to care for sick and destitute pilgrims arriving in the Holy Land. However, as the Muslim threat grew, they became not only a medical organization, but also a powerful military force, protecting Christian lands from invasion. The Hospitallers took part in many crusades, and their military brotherhood became one of the most influential knightly orders of the Middle Ages. Their influence spread throughout Europe, and their role in politics and military affairs remained significant until the Renaissance. The Order of the Templars was perhaps the most famous and mystical knightly order of the Middle Ages. Founded in 1118, the order was originally intended to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. As the order grew, its knights began to control large territories and also became key players in the political and financial affairs of Europe. The Templars played an important role in the Crusades, but their ambitions were not limited to war. They became a powerful financial network, providing services such as loans and protecting trade routes, making them the richest and most influential knightly orders of their time. However, from the 14th century onwards, the order was dissolved by the French king Philip IV, who wanted access to its wealth. The secrecy and mysterious customs of the order, including their symbols and rituals, continue to be the subject of many myths and legends. Teutonic Order was founded in 1290 during the Third Crusade, and initially focused on caring for pilgrims and defending the Christian faith in the Holy Land. However, over time, the order shifted its efforts to Eastern Europe, where it became a key player in the fight against pagan tribes and in the process of Christianizing the region. The Teutons played an important role in the development of what would become Livonia, as well as in the struggle against Russia and other nations on Europe's eastern borders. During the Middle Ages, the order wielded enormous political and military power, making it one of the most influential knightly orders. But the order eventually declined when the Protestant Reformation weakened its power in the 16th century. Knightly orders were not only military and religious structures, they became important political players in the Middle Ages. With lands and wealth, knights in these orders often became feudal lords, ruling territories and even playing a key role in European politics. For example, the Hospitallers and the Templars had their fortresses and lands all over Europe, and the Teutonic Order created its own state in the Baltic region, which continued to exist until the 19th century. The Hospitaller Order still exists as a minor knightly order, continuing its charitable missions.